to religion than I even knew. So I stopped going to church, which was huge for me because I always went to church no matter where I was and anywhere I was going. I always went to church on Sunday. So I stopped going to church and I started going to the BaHai gatherings, the 19-day feast. I started meeting the people, meeting Perry's friends, his family, and I started getting attracted to these people. I thought that they were very kind. They were never pushy. They were just hospitable all the time. And although these were wonderful BaHais in my life, it changed my concept of who he was and where he came from. So I started studying under somebody who was he was a college teacher for history, so he knew a lot of history in general. And so when I talked to him, he was talking to me on the basis of what I knew. So I went to Bible college. I didn't learn Christianity the way other Christians do from the church or from the clergy. I learned it from the writings. I read the writings on a daily basis, and I studied it very in depth. So what I knew was true, and I knew that there was no mistaking it. So when I talked to him, he would talk to me on the same level. He knew where I was, and so he would talk to me as though I knew history and he knew history, so we were constantly comparing things and then discussing things, and sometimes we would debate things, but then he would always come back to a very gracious attitude. He was never like, I'm right and you're wrong. So the more and more I hung out with this person, the more I learned from him, the more I realized that I was really attracted to whatever this was. And although I was really afraid to become a Baha'i, even though I knew that it was something that was good and possibly maybe ordained by God, I was completely afraid because I knew that if I had taken a step towards this religion, my family would disown me. And that was my fear because I had such a close relationship with my family. So the more and more I kept praying about it and praying to God that no matter what happened, I would just follow him, even if it meant somewhere completely different. My mind and my heart just kept connecting. And when I was reading the Baha'i faith and what I was learning in school and Christianity was connecting. And so it became to a point where it was inevitable that I had to make that decision for myself. Nobody told me I did. I had to make that decision for myself. And so I actually made that decision through a dream because I was debating this concept of Baha'i faith and Christianity and maybe losing my family. So I just told God I will never be a Baha'i, but I will always talk well about it, and that way I could always keep my family close. And then in a dream, God came to me, and it was a discussion with him where I was debating and saying I could never do this, I could never turn my back against my family. And then in that dream, it's changed to a point where I was standing in front of my family, or I was sitting in front of my family, my father, my mother, my brother, and telling them that I was a Baha'i. And I realized at that moment that that was very profound, because what I was doing was telling them something that I thought I would never do. And my brother was holding my hand saying, everything's going to be fine. My mother was crying, but she was still there. And my father was mad at me, but he was still there. So when I looked at it, I realized if this is it, I can handle this. And so at that moment, I told God I was a Baha'i. I said I will become a Baha'i, and I declare that as my new path. And I don't know if it's right, but I know that my heart says it's right. And so I just believe that if I took that leap of faith, I would do it. That everything would be fine and my answers would be answered. And so I immediately woke up Perry and said, I'm a Baha'i, and he was like, all right, go back to sleep. Like his immediate response was, I don't know what you're talking about. So I became a Baha'i about 4 years ago. And ever since then, everything I've learned has just been progressing. So I've never lost what I've learned in the past. All my degree in biblical theology has only enhanced my relationship with Baha'u'llah. And so for me, that was the biggest key. And my family at first was very angry with me. It took me a long time to confess it to them that I was a Baha'i. And each one of them had their own struggles. But in the end, they all told me that they loved me for who I was, that they believed that I was in the path of God, even though they didn't believe in my path. But they knew that I wasn't outside of God's will. And so in the last 4 years, my relationship with my parents has actually grown because I've become a Baha'i. And so that's why.
So what did you learn in your studies?
I learned a lot about the path of Christ. I learned about the history of how the the Bible was made, I learned how to interpret the writings based on what it was at that generation, not based on what I think it believes to me. So like there are certain writings that say when people are not equally yoked, then they shouldn't be together. And there's a lot of concepts and a lot of metaphors in the Bible. And what I learned was that you're not supposed to take it out and make it a personalized interpretation for yourself. It's supposed to be an interpreted by what God had said at that moment in that time. And although it can be interpreted to this generation, it's not meant for this generation, it's meant for that generation. And even in Christianity, I learned that. I learned that, if you're going to read scripture, you have to know the beginning and the ending of why that statement was said. And so I learned a lot about the history and the relationship between God and man, and how God is constantly coming into man's life and showing him the way and taking him out of certain circumstances and then putting him back onto another path, and constantly just being involved in man's life. And then one thing I did learn in Christianity was that the book ends, that the Bible does end. And even the pastors know that the Bible ends, but they are looking for the rapture, or they're looking for the end days, because they constantly say that we are in the end days. But if you go to Bible school, you learn that we have always been in the end days, because the concepts, or not all the concepts relate to this generation, because there's nothing about gambling. It says you shouldn't gamble, but you can gamble. The concept of alcohol, it says not to get drunk, but it doesn't say you can't drink. And so it's like little things like that, things that pertain more to this generation, that I've noticed that people are twisting for it to change this generation, because there's no answers in the Bible for this generation, or all the answers. And so those are things that I had personally gotten to a point where I was like, all right, there's got to be more to this. And that's one of the other reasons why at the time when I met Perry, that it was easier for me to become a BaHai, because I was open.
So when you're talking about Baha'u'llah, changing, adding to it and saying, okay, this is what I've learned now.
Mm-hmm.
Give me some examples.
Okay. There was a few times when I was in class when the teacher would talk about how the Bible does talk about when the second coming of Christ would come. He would be coming on a cloud. The seven-day evangelists actually had the exact date, and they went to Mount Carmel looking for Jesus on the cloud. I was listening and reading these articles in class and with my teacher as he was talking to me about it. At the exact same time, during that time, I was actually involved in a Ruhi book where we were learning the background of Baha'u'llah and his history, like how he began, how he declared, his entire history. So then, at the exact date the teacher was talking about it, I remember that date being the date that when Baha'u'llah had proclaimed that he was the next manifestation. And the teacher said at this point in time is when the world, he's like, even though they didn't see Jesus Christ on the cloud, at that time there were all these cults establishing, there was all these people being involved in religions, and there was he said there was this paradigm shift in the world. And he's all like, and people were running to the churches, and there was a big spirit in the world at this time. And I'm listening to this from a teacher who's also a pastor, who's teaching me about Christianity and teaching me about the history of Christianity in the world. And he's telling me at this particular date, there was this paradigm shift. And I'm learning at the exact same time that this particular date was the time when Baha'u'llah had declared that he was the next manifestation. And every time I would go to class, it would be little things like that, where I would learn something that totally was parallel to what I was learning and was encouraging me to know that I was in the right path and I had made the right decision. So that was one in particular situation where I learned something at the exact same time, and it only progressed my relationship. But can't think of anything else right now.
Okay.
The Ruhi books are a curriculum of study that we use in study circles, and they're used around the world, and they're translated into many languages. And it's a sequence of books. The first one's about life after death and the nature of the soul. And we have one about teaching children, teaching junior youth, the history of the Baha'i faith. And you can travel anywhere in the world and participate in one of these study circles or facilitate. Once you've completed the series, you can facilitate them. So it's kind of a very unique example of how this really is a global community. Everything we do has a global focus. Each of the temples or the houses of worship for the Baha'i faith, they've been built sequentially on different continents. And the contributions are given anonymously and voluntarily by the Baha'is around the world. But that money, and only Baha'is can contribute to the fund, and that fund is used to build these houses of worship. And so we would all build the one in India, this lotus temple there on the wall. And currently we're all collectively building a house of worship in Chile. So it's another example of how the faith has this global focus. And problems of the world that we're facing today are global problems, and we can only solve them as a world community. We can't solve pollution and global warming or currency wars or even some of the wars. We can't solve them as nations. We have to work together as a global community. And a lot of people say that the Baha'i faith is it's kind of very unrealistic and claiming or believing in unity, that world unity is possible. But we have a blueprint of this world administrative order that Baha'u'llah gave us, and it's growing in the world today. We're making it happen. There's a system of election without partisan politics, without people standing. Nobody stands for election. There's this concept of a servant leadership that we elect local people, 9 local people, then 9 national people, and then at the international level we have 9 people. And we can do that without partisan politics and in a spirit of unity. And the leaders that are elected are very, very humble, and they serve the community.